Okay, hi students. Welcome to today's supermarket sweep. Our goal here is to actually start applying what we learned in plant anatomy to some actual plants. And so today we're going to actually use just your common vegetables you might use to cook in the kitchen. So when you think about food, maybe with something like a steak or a piece of meat, you might know that that comes from the cow rump. It's really tasty. But have you ever thought about, what parts of the plant you're eating when you eat vegetables? And so we're going to do that today and kind of have you guys make some guesses as to what you think these different plant parts are that we're eating. And you can use some of your clues that you learned in your plant anatomy lesson, but I wouldn't be too simple about it. It's not like you can say anything above ground is a stem or a leaf, or all green things are leaves necessarily. There's lots of things people tend to do when they think about plant parts, and you kind of got some nuances in the plant anatomy lesson that should help you realize that those things aren't probably the best way to go about this. So let's take a look at what we have here. So on the table we have a suite of vegetables that you might eat, from onions to carrots to peas, Brussels sprouts, asparagus, celery, a tomato, and even some potatoes. And so I'm going to actually in just a second here zoom in and show you some different features of the plants without using the plant anatomy names, and then I'll give you guys an opportunity to do a little thinking about what parts these plants are. All right, so why don't we get started with our supermarket sweep. And so what your goal is, just to remind you, is trying to figure out which plant part, which plant anatomy you're actually eating when you eat different vegetables. So I'll show you a series of vegetables here, point out some key features, and then I'll have a couple others that are in photos just because of the time of year. So first, this here is a leek, which is in the onion family. And so it's pretty similar to an onion, and you can see a little dirt along this part here, so part of it's underground. And there's a long stalk with a green top, and at the bottom you see these hairs coming off. What you can't see very well on this particular vegetable, but I'll show you on the next one, is there's actually a disc of tissue at the base of the stalk, which the hairs come out of. And so that's what an onion looks like. And this here is some celery. And by the way, I'm not assuming you don't know what these vegetables look like. You do eat them, but a lot of times you don't see them as you would when you pull them out of the garden. You just see like a piece, or a lot of times they're already cut up for you. So this is just your opportunity, if you haven't seen vegetables in their true form, to see them. So here's our celery, and this one also has a long stalk. Coming off of the stalks here, you can kind of see these fleshy green pieces that are coming off. And down here you can see it more clearly, this thick disc of material. So typically when you harvest celery, you don't actually get the hairs too, but there would be some hairs actually out into the soil where these things grow. So this is what celery looks like. I'll show you one more that has kind of a long stalk-like appearance, and that's asparagus. And you can see this vegetable here. You can see there's some interesting things on the top here and little triangles going down the stalk, and it's mostly all green. So you can kind of see that pretty well. Depending on how you eat your peas, this is a pea, and I'll open one up here while I talk about them. So this is the pod of a pea, and some of you probably only eat or have seen the inside of the pods, and I'll open that up so you can see here. There we go. So you can see these little round peas. That's what you usually eat, but in a lot of cultures you might actually eat the whole pod in a stir fry or in a salad or something. So here's your peas. And let's see, another one you know well, maybe haven't seen the whole plant, is carrots. And you can see there's some green stuff coming off the top of the carrot. And then you've got the orange part here. And if you look really closely, there's actually little hairs coming off the orange part. and even a longer hair at the bottom of this one. So this is what your carrot actually looks like. And the final one, I almost don't need to show you, right? But just to be thorough, here's your tomato. Move it over just a hair. And so you can see that you've got green parts and the fleshy part here coming off the green part. And so we talked a lot about this in our lesson already, right? What do you call this? Fruit, vegetable, what is this? And so you guys can kind of just be reminded what the beautiful tomato looks like. And if we cut this up inside, there'd be seeds, right, inside of this. So these are some of the vegetables I just wanted to share with you in their true form. And then I'll also show you broccoli and Brussels sprouts. I think one other that I can't recall, but you'll see in just a minute. I'll just show you pictures as we go through, and I'll kind of quiz you on some of these vegetables. Before we do that, though, have any of you been wondering why I'm calling this a supermarket sweep? Well, some of you may know if you were watching TV in the 90s, and some of you may not, but there was a really awesome game show called Supermarket Sweep, and I think I would have won the game show if I could have been on it. You basically had to know trivia, and then you had to fill your cart with as many expensive groceries as you could in about 3 minutes. And I would be yelling at people on the screen, go for the diapers, go for the filet mignon. So I was ready for this game. So it's kind of ironic that we're doing a supermarket sweep or kind of trivia or quiz with vegetables, because the vegetable aisle is probably the last place I'd go if I'm trying to rack up my bill at a grocery store. So with that irony in mind, let's move forward. You've now seen some of these vegetables kind of close up, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to think about these first 6 vegetables. So why don't you pause the video and kind of take a few minutes to guess what you think the vegetable anatomy is for these different vegetables we eat. Okay, pause. And welcome back. Okay, so let's see what you were thinking. So I think the most obvious one, the tomato, we can start with that. Since that's essentially a fruit, right? We all know it's a fruit. It's got seeds inside of it. Sometimes you call it a vegetable, but botanically it's a fruit. So we'll start there. That one's easy. And so basically, after the ovules are fertilized by the pollen grain, you have a fertilized zygote, and this is inside the ovary, which basically swells as the fruit matures to form this big, luscious, delicious fruit. And this fruit is delicious for animals and insects and birds, and maybe hopefully helps propagate seeds. So that one was pretty easy. How about asparagus? What did you guys think for that? So asparagus looks kind of like a long stem. Maybe you thought that stem is your answer. It's actually correct. And let's just quickly draw our little asparagus spear here. So if you pretend this is your asparagus spear, how could you have been clued in that this was really stem and not some other modified vegetable part? Well, you might have noticed that there were these little leaf-like structures going down the side of the stem at kind of regular intervals. And so these would be your nodes. And then the space in between your internodes. And so that would be a piece of evidence you could use to argue that asparagus is a stem. Okay, so how about those carrots? Now there wasn't anything too unique about carrots, except for we saw, we'll add a little, do some stuff to make it look more real, that there was these green stuff coming up and a bunch of leaves. The other thing we noted in the film is that there was some hairs coming off of it. But you saw nothing else coming off of this part that you know is below ground. It doesn't seem like there's anything else serving as a root, so you might have guessed that this is a root. And it is. It's actually a taproot. So there's your carrot. What about peas? Well, peas are complicated. Are we talking about sugar snap peas like I showed you? Which is basically like a pod with the hint of peas inside? Or are you just talking about the peas? So if you're talking about the whole unit and you're eating it in your salad, that would be a fruit. Peas are a legume, which we'll talk more about, and they often have these pods. And inside of them would be seeds. And so each little pea is a seed, actually. So if you just eat peas for dinner, then this is how it looks. So that's our peas. Celery is one of the tricky ones. Students always get a little mad about celery. So let's think about what you can observe with celery. You've got a bunch of stalks, right, that all come around to this disc, and then you got some leaves on top, and so this would be your celery, right? And so you know there's leaves, you know there's this round disc, what is that? And then you got a bunch of these stalks. So typically, if you have a main stem, like with asparagus, you'd have a bunch of stems that would have leaves on the end coming off, right? If the asparagus didn't have these modified little leaf bits clinging to the stem. So how can you have a whole bunch of stalks and still be a main stem? It doesn't really totally make sense. But what if I told you you can think back to your anatomy lesson when we talked about bulbs, and you might remember that in bulbs, and onions have this same thing as we'll see, this disc on the bottom is actually a modified stem, and then you've got leaves at the top. So what usually comes between the main stem of the plants and the leaves? The part you're eating is actually the petiole. And some folks call this a leaf stem, and it is. It's very stem-like, but it's definitely not the main stem. It's a different structure altogether that has been the part that we're eating. Okay, so onion also has this similar modified stem on the bottom, and then it comes up like so, and then there's just like leaves coming out of it, right? And so if you cut into your onion, you see layers, right, inside. They look kind of like leaves, except they're white. And if you actually pulled apart some of your leaf layers, you'd see that they kind of connect in to them. And so onions are particularly weird. This is actually swollen leaf base. So this one's pretty hard, but the way that you would figure it out, and it's even more obvious with leeks, because as you peel back each green leaf layer, you can see that it extends all the way down into the layers of the actual oniony part that we eat. That really, this white part is just an extension of these leaves. And so each little layer of onion is a leaf, kind of whirled around one another. And so that's actually a swollen leaf base. So here's some of our vegetables we saw on the table. Let's go to the next page. So potatoes and sweet potatoes. So potatoes are interesting. So right here you can see at the bottom of the image, we've got some roots. I'm actually going to change the pen color real quick because it's actually hard to see. And I'll just draw over this so you can see it better. There we go. We've got roots. Then there's these potatoes, and they don't really seem to be serving a root function. But if they're not roots, what could they be? And hopefully you guys might recall from your anatomy lesson that you just looked at, but there's also modified stems called tubers, and that is another word for a potato. And these, when you let your potatoes go for too long, these are actually stems growing out of the potato. Literally, when we grow potatoes in our garden, we take a piece of potato and plant it in the ground. And stems come up from these eyes. These are called the eyes where the stems emerge. So that's a potato. It's actually a modified stem. It's another one of those storage organs for a plant. What about sweet potatoes? Is it a modified stem too? Well, I can tell you that sweet potatoes do not have eyes, nor do stems arise from them. So they don't seem to be made of stem tissue. And if you look here, you don't really see roots like you do over on the potato plant. So actually, this is kind of the main root here. But then you've got all these little side roots. Yeah, and that's what these sweet potato are. They're basically side roots. And you don't need to know this, but just in case you see the term, they're called adventitious roots. But don't worry about that. They're kind of the roots that come off the side of the main root. And they're another storage organ. But you can see very different roots versus stems, but they're both pretty much a potato-like vegetable that we love to eat. Brussels sprouts. You definitely needed to see this on the plant, I think, to understand what's going on here. So, looking at this image, if I give you a minute to kind of orient yourself and look at it, you're welcome to pause at any time if you don't want me to give you the punchline away. But you can kind of see it seems like maybe this is sort of the main stem, maybe. You've got leaves on the top. So what do you think all of these little mini cabbage looking things are coming off the main stem? Any ideas? So I think there's a couple options here. You could think like the asparagus that maybe you've got, these are just some nodes where some leaves arise. So that might be something you might think about. But specifically, what usually grows kind of in a sideways fashion as opposed to up and down off the stem? Anyone? Yes. If you were thinking axillary buds, then you are spot on. That's actually what Brussels sprouts are. So you can see we eat a very interesting, diverse set of plants. So our last one is broccoli, which I didn't have on the table, but you all know what broccoli looks like. That's the image in the top left. But in the bottom right, I would like to draw your attention to these little yellow things. And man, you don't see these unless you grow broccoli and you don't pick them in time. If you pick your broccoli, you'll never arrive at this point. If you leave them out there, these are the flowers, actually, of the broccoli plant that could potentially be pollinated. And this is what happens when your broccoli bolts. So if this is the flower, then what is this? Is it a stem? Is it leaves? You know, I would say these are leaves, right? Obviously leaves. So this one's a little bit tougher, but this is actually considered something called an immature inflorescence or flower. Immature meaning it's not really the mature flower like the yellow flowers you see. So broccoli are just a little bit weird. You know, typically you might have your flowers like enclosed in a bud, and then the bud opens and the petals release. So, you know, you could kind of think of it like that, but it's really just a very unique thing as to how broccoli actually works. So it's really just the immature flower, and then when it bolts, as it sits out in the sun for a longer period of time, that's when you get the actual, more traditional flowers you're used to seeing. So I'll just quickly share with you two more slides. You can always hit pause if you like, and these just give you kind of a little bit of a summary of some of the different vegetables. And there's a couple on here that we didn't highlight in my supermarket sweep, but here we have another fruit, butternut squash. So much like tomatoes, we think of them as vegetables, but botanically they're fruits. They're swollen ovary, seeds inside. You can see, let's see, something else that was interesting here. Oh yes, so ginger was mentioned in the anatomy lesson that you just worked through. This is another one of those stems. It's actually modified stem and it's underground typically. That's ginger. This here, these are leeks. You heard me say the word leek before with onions. And so actually, every time you peel back a leaf, the leaf, including this leaf base, the white part that's oniony, all comes away as one whole unit. And so that's a really nice way to make it clear that this white part is just an extension of the leaves. It's just that in onions, you know, it's actually swollen down there. And so you've seen these other things here, so that we'll skip by. And then the last one is in black and white, but I like this one because it kind of really lets you really envision where different plant parts are coming from. And so you can kind of see that here. And we saw most of these today, and with the exception of spinach, which I think most of you know that that's a leaf. But at least this just lets you kind of view the plant and the vegetables side by side, so you can take a look at that. So with that, hopefully this helped you better visualize and think about plant anatomy and apply it to some actual plants. And so when you start working in your groups for your particular plant book, you'll be able to think about some of these terms and what they mean so that you can visualize your plants and also think about how to help your classmates visualize your plants when you teach them a little bit about your plants in a few weeks from now.